committee is resuming its study of the barriers to Indigenous economic development. And I do want to welcome our witnesses for the first panel. We have
idea, which is just chucking toothbrushes out of airplanes.
Hey, Minister of Public Services,
Pierre
and they will be joined by officials from the Department of Indigenous Services, including Gina Wilson, Deputy Minister, Keith Kahn, Assistant Deputy Minister, Lands and Economic Development, Jessica Sultan, Director General, Economic Policy Development, and from the Department of Public Works and Government Services, we have Ariane Reza, the Deputy Minister, Catherine Poulin, Assistant Deputy Minister, Departmental Oversight Branch. So ministers, welcome. You will each have 10 minutes for your opening statements, after which we will proceed to the rounds of questions, and we will start with Minister Duclos.
There you go, you're first. We were taking bets about who was first. He lost.
It's alphabetical.
Patty and I thought he would start with the best one and leave the other one after, but that is your choice, Chair. You're
always the charmer, always the charmer.
You're the decision maker. Et j'aimerais commencer évidemment par vous remercier de nous avoir.
And I'd like to start by thanking you for having invited me and Minister Haidu to discuss the important issue of Indigenous procurement. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we're meeting is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. I am accompanied, as you said, today by two officials from Public Services and Procurement Canada, the Deputy Minister, Ariane Reza, and the Assistant Deputy Minister, Department Oversight Branch, Catherine Poulin. The Government of Canada recognizes the negative and ongoing impact of colonization on the self-determination and the economic independence of Indigenous peoples. My department, PSPC, has been working on the reconciliation efforts by ensuring that Indigenous companies and entrepreneurs are involved in the Government of Canada's procurement process. The procurement strategy is very important as a government tool for economic reconciliation and has been so for many years. Here are some tangible results and successes. First of all, PSPC's work with Indigenous peoples to integrate arts, Indigenous themes, and Indigenous materials in parliamentary precinct projects such as the Centre Block, the new Parliament Welcome Block, the grounds of Canada Parliament held in the Block 2 redevelopment project.
Initiative to modernize pilot and aircrew training for the Royal Canadian Air Force, which includes a clear commitment to dedicate at least 5% of the contract value to creating professional and skilled employment opportunities for Indigenous workers from apprenticeships to executive roles. Or the new Canada Dental Care Plan with a 3-year partnership between Sun Life and the tribal Wiche-Wewin Capital Corporation that will create more than 175 jobs in Winnipeg. To achieve this, the government relies on the Indigenous Business Directory to administer the strategy, and I know that Indigenous Services Canada is working very well and very strongly with its partners and exploring new ways to improve the registration and validation processes. In the last year, the government has taken firm action to protect the integrity of that important federal procurement system from the effects of bad actors. The process of addressing fraudulent cases must be free of any political interference. And that is why at PSPC we created the Office of Supplier Integrity and Compliance, or OSIC, to enhance the department's capacity to respond to instances of supplier wrongdoing. OSIC is acting independently from political interference and already ruled against cases where there were concerns of wrongdoing. We also introduced the new ineligibility and suspension policy to provide OSIC with a range of actions on a much broader scope of misconduct. For example, suppliers who violate the integrity of the procurement process can be suspended and debarred, even without a criminal charge or conviction. Mr. Chair, the process by which concerns are assessed by OSIC can happen in two ways. First, departments and agencies can come forward with concerns about wrongdoing, and second, OSIC can also initiate an assessment itself based on information provided by a trusted source. In either case, Mr. Chair, it is critical that PSPC is made aware of wrongdoing as soon as possible so steps can be taken to rectify the situation. And I can tell you that officials at my department are actively engaged with other federal organizations to ensure that instances of supplier misconduct are promptly referred to OSIC. In closing, Mr. Chair, PSPC will continue to use the government's buying power to help advance economic reconciliation. Canada's prosperity cannot afford to exclude the diverse range of skills and experience Indigenous businesses and people contribute. To realize this potential, we must also safeguard the integrity of Canada's federal procurement system and ensure value for money. Thank you, and I would eventually be very happy to answer the committee's questions.
Thank you very much, Minister Duclos. And with that, we'll move on to our next witness, the Honourable Patty Hajdu. You have 10 minutes or less for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and it's a great place that my colleague has left off, because my role here today is to highlight the importance of fostering strong Indigenous economic opportunities through programs like the PSIB, or the Procurement Strategy for Indigenous Business. For decades, Indigenous peoples were intentionally excluded from opportunities to develop local economies and participate more broadly in the national economy. The short-sighted policies of previous governments meant that, whether intentional or as a consequence of exclusionary policy, Indigenous businesses and economies have been held back. But that is short-sighted for Indigenous peoples and communities and Canada's economy alike. Supporting Indigenous entrepreneurs who are job creators or making access to capital available for major projects is good for people, communities, and Canada's overall economy. Investing in Indigenous communities and building up Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs benefits all Canadians. According to the 2022 National Indigenous Economic Strategy for Canada, the continued exclusion of Indigenous peoples costs the Canadian economy $27.7 billion every year. The National Indigenous Economic Development Board found that closing the existing employment gap could help lift over 150,000 Indigenous people out of poverty. There is a real cost to inaction. Indigenous people are an untapped resource in Canada's market. Since 2015, we've been focused on strengthening self-determination and building capacity so Indigenous peoples have the tools and resources to fully participate in the economy on their own terms. Federal funding for programs like the Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program, managed by the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association and Métis Capital Corporations, is creating opportunities for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis business owners to launch or grow their businesses. Indigenous financial institutions have existed since the late 1980s. Over the past 35 years, the program has issued approximately 52,000 business loans worth $3.2 billion, with a repayment rate of over 95%. For every $1 million lent by Indigenous financial institutions, $3.6 million is produced in total gross domestic product, GDP, for Canada. Successive governments have recognized that access to capital is a key to economic reconciliation, and that the results of these investments can be seen in communities across the country. For example, Ulnuweg Development Corp., Inc., the Indigenous financial institution for the Atlantic, has played a key role in supporting Indigenous entrepreneurs. To date, it's funded over 1,900 projects worth over $71 million. And this funding has supported entrepreneurs in the fishing, aquaculture, and marine servicing industries, creating a strong First Nations-led industry in the region and boosting the local economy. Investing in Indigenous communities and building up Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs benefits all regions in our country. It's why Budget 2024 announced $319.8 million over 5 years to provide much-needed additional capital for Indigenous financial institutions and Métis capital corporations to support the growing needs of entrepreneurs. While investing in Indigenous business is important, it starts with a strong base. Building up communities with new or renovated schools, healthcare centres, water treatment plants, all-season roads, and housing is investing in Canada's productivity and economy overall. A recent report from the AFN found that every dollar invested in infrastructure generates $1.82 in economic output for First Nations communities. Since 2015, we've increased funding for education, health, infrastructure, and housing by over 1,100%. We're working with partners on community-led solutions, and we're making progress. For example, to close the housing gap, we've supported 5,300 housing projects in 611 First Nations communities since April of 2016. More kindergarten to grade 12 schools are being built so children can access high-quality education without leaving home, including in communities like Tataskvak Cree Nation in northern Manitoba, Yabtamung First Nation in northern Ontario, Piikani First Nation in Alberta. Strong communities produce strong community members, who in turn are the leaders that will shape the decades to come. Procurement is another key part of building the Indigenous economy. The National Indigenous Economic Strategy, which was developed by over 20 Indigenous organizations, sees procurement as a key component of accessing financial capital so that Indigenous peoples can achieve economic and social prosperity on their own terms. The strategy also recommends that all levels of government and industry have mandatory Indigenous procurement targets. In 2021, the federal government implemented a 5% Indigenous procurement target set for all departments. Tabitha Bull, some of you have heard from her, CEO of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business, called it a pivotal moment in harnessing the potential of the Indigenous economy. And since then, the value of contracts going to Indigenous businesses has increased to approximately $1.6 billion. And there's tangible economic benefits to companies who have, for the first time, the Government of Canada for their customer. From experience to system navigation to growth of opportunity, government procurement can be a valuable component in the sales trajectory of an Indigenous company. Now that we're seeing success in bringing Indigenous companies into the sphere of government procurement, the federal government is working with partners to transform the procurement strategy. It's clear that this program must be transformed and transferred to the control of partners. To do so respects the principles of self-determination and responds to the calls from Indigenous leaders themselves. Central to advancing self-determination and economic reconciliation is ensuring that Indigenous peoples participate in and shape the decisions that deeply affect them. It's why I convened with the private sector, Indigenous leadership, and other government departments 2 economic reconciliation roundtables to date, and others planned for 2025, to identify and create solutions to government and corporate barriers to Indigenous economic activity. And we're using that information as we work with partners on a renewed federal economic policy to support First Nations, Inuit, and Métis economic development. I can see by the focus of the members in this committee that we agree the federal government has a real opportunity and a role to foster Indigenous economic prosperity, including by safeguarding the 5% minimum target and the procurement strategy for Indigenous businesses. Programs that increase economic activity across Canada is just common sense. The continued exclusion of Indigenous people from the economy costs the Canadian economy, as I said before, $27.7 billion every year. And so we can't afford to ignore opportunities to build up this economy. By working together to remove barriers to economic development and to supporting Indigenous businesses, we are making progress towards long-term well-being and prosperity in communities across Canada. I look forward to answering your questions and further discussing the importance of economic reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And that concludes the opening remarks. We'll move into our first panel, our first round of questions, the 6-minute round, starting with the Conservative Party and Mr. Barrett.
Minister Hajdu, a former auditor for the Indigenous Procurement Program has stated that your Liberal government was warned about specific cases of alleged fraud. He said the government hamstrung auditors and repeatedly ignored warnings that the program was being abused by non-Indigenous companies. Why did you ignore the auditors' warnings?
Well, first of all, I was deeply concerned to hear of this weekend. It was the first I heard of this allegation, and it took immediate action with the department, and I am calling for a full external audit of the program.
A full external audit. In the case that's been outlined in the remarks of the former auditor, we see that having the government check its own work is not actually oversight. Are you able to tell us at whose direction Indigenous Services Canada determined that the department would take on full responsibility for confirming the eligibility of Indigenous businesses for the program after 2021?
Well, what I can say is, first of all, I just want to thank you for the question, and it's clear by your question that we agree that a 5% procurement target is important and that we need to ensure that any program like this has integrity. So I appreciate the question. And I agree with you that if we don't have integrity of this program, that we're not actually going to be able to satisfy not just Canadians, but Indigenous people that a program like this is actually working to their goals. What I can say is that the company that was contracted by Indigenous Services Canada to do this work has made these allegations. They're very serious. As I said, I'm extremely concerned. I found out about these concerns this weekend and took immediate action to call for an external audit. The department is working now on what that will look like and will come back to me with a plan.
Minister, is it your belief today that the program has integrity?
It is my belief that there are many aspects of the program that are delivering for Indigenous companies. But look, even some misuse of the program puts the program at risk. And so for me, an allegation like that auditor has made is very serious. And I think we should all take it seriously and we should act on it.
Minister Duclos, were you aware of Randy Boissonneau's claims of Indigenous heritage that were echoed and promoted by the Liberal Party of Canada, both on their social media and in fundraising efforts? Were you aware that he had made those claims?
Comme vous, je suis l'actualité.
Like you, I read the news, I listen to my colleagues' remarks, and like you, or maybe less than you, because last week we heard MP Randy Boissonneau speak about that issue.
Raised off of what was a false claim. It was a lie that had been put forward. Now, if the lie was not Mr. Boissonneau, and Mr. Boissonneau claims it wasn't him who told the lie, in which case that would rest with the Liberal Party. They fundraised off it, and we've seen multiple instances now where they're trying to, the Liberal Party is trying to cover this up. Media has continued to report more and more revelations that what Mr. Boissonneau says and what is true are often very different things. Do you think that Canadians should be concerned that the Liberal Party of Canada fundraised off of what we now know to be a lie, where Mr. Boissonneau had claimed to have Indigenous heritage, and that he used that same, his company used that same false claim in an attempt to disenfranchise Indigenous-owned businesses and win contracts under that false pretense?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Carr, point of order.
Yeah, just perhaps the record can show, I think we established quite clearly last meeting when Mr. Boissonneau was present that he did not claim
That's not a point of order.
Heritage, nor did he at any point. So perhaps my colleagues across the way, when making such insinuations, can be mindful of what the facts show.
Well, on that point of order, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. Point of order, Mr. Barrett.
Yeah, as you well know, Mr. Carr's intervention is not a point of order. It does not reference any standing order. It's simply debate in an attempt to interrupt the proceedings. I was very respectful in my exchange and offering time to the ministers. What I'd ask is that Liberal members be as respectful, even if they're trying to cover for what is shameful behavior by the Liberal member for Edmonton, Randy Boissonneau, and his
point of order,
lies
Mr.
and
Chair.
false claims.
Same point of order.
So thank you, Mr. Barrett. We're quickly getting into debate here, but Mr. Carr, do you have a point of order? That
Just very quickly on the same point of order, Mr. Barrett, I believe, began referencing shameful behavior and other allegations, which I don't think are actually points of order. Just for reference, thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. Let's get back to asking the questions that we're all here to hear the testimony of the ministers. I'm going to turn the floor back over to Mr. Barrett. You have a little bit more than 2 minutes left. I'd stop the clock, and so I'll hand the floor back to you, Mr. Barrett.
Before your Liberal colleague attempted to interfere to cover up for the shameful behavior and lies of Liberal MP Randy Boissonneau with respect to his claims to Indigenous heritage and attempting to defraud Indigenous-owned businesses of their ability to get government contracts, and the Liberal Party of Canada promoting that lie in an attempt to raise funds off that false claim. Minister, do you think that behavior is appropriate and that Canadians should be concerned with the Liberal Party's actions in this case?
I'm not the chair of this committee, so I cannot determine whether MP Carr's intervention was a point of order. But what I know is that what he said was correct. No? The making false allegations, making all sorts of falsehoods sound true because they're all compiled together is not a fair treatment of the facts, and I would suggest again that you get back to what the MP Boissonnault said to you just last week, and you ask him those questions if you think they are relevant.
So what we know
important.
to be true, Minister, is that every time that Mr. Boissonnault came before a standing committee, that what he said was later proven to be not true, that he has demonstrated himself to be someone who is not truthful or honest. So we can't refer to Mr. Boissonnault's testimony as what is honest or right. What we know, the facts are, that the Liberal Party of Canada promoted what was a false claim about Randy Boissonnault's Indigenous heritage. This was my question to you. Your party, sir, the Liberal Party fundraised off of what we know to be not true. And Canadians are, of course, concerned about this. This type of dishonesty borders on corruption when Canadians don't know what the government has said, whether or not it's true or it's not true. Should Canadians be concerned with the actions of your party when we know that one of your former cabinet colleagues showed a pattern for dishonesty and lies, up to and including...
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I believe Mr. Barrett is an experienced... oh, yeah.
Point of order, Mr. Carr.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Barrett's an experienced parliamentarian. He knows that he can't refer to a member's behavior as lying. In fact, my Conservative colleagues across the way did this on multiple occasions last meeting, and in fact, it was a Conservative chair that correctly ruled at that moment in time that that was unparliamentary language. He should apologize and withdraw that comment. Thank you.
That's not what I said.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. We are getting just to the end of the time. Mr. Barrett had asked a question. I'm going to give the minister an opportunity.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Carr?
Yeah. When a member is referred to by another member as a liar, whether that's in the chamber or at committee, it requires a withdrawal and an apology. So I think that as chair, you should be giving an indication of what you expect in terms of the way that members comport themselves around the table. I appreciate that we want to get to a further line of questioning, but when one member calls another a liar, not only does that in and of itself delay the proceedings, forcing someone like myself to raise a point of order, but further to that, it does require the chair to give an indication that there should be an apology and a withdrawal, at the very least a withdrawal of the commentary. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. And I do want to remind members to ensure that you are using parliamentary language at all time. You'll know that in Standing Order 18, you're not to use disrespectful or offensive language. And I just want to remind members of this. We don't want to get into this kind of behavior in this committee. We want to be able to get the testimony that we're all seeking to do here and that the House indeed ordered us to do. So I would just want to remind members to do that and just to not use disrespectful or offensive language in this committee. We are at the end of this time, but I want to give Minister Duclos an opportunity to respond.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais juste répéter.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to repeat in French what I said in English a few minutes. Amalgamating various things that might seem true at a very high level, but that are collectively wrong is not a good way of proceeding. I would propose that the MP continues his discussion with the MP in question.
To our second questioner in the first round of questions, Mr. Carr, you have 6 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Duclos, nice to see you. We haven't had the chance to hear from you often at this committee, but unfortunately, I'm going to direct my questions to Minister Hajdu. Minister, we've talked a lot, you and I, both here, outside of committee, in my hometown of Winnipeg, specifically about the many ways in which we've progressed together with Indigenous communities in Manitoba and across the country, the ambitions and the goals of realizing critical economic development and economic reconciliation. I'm thinking specifically of projects like the downtown healthcare facility that's going to be built out of Portage Place that wouldn't happen without millions of dollars of federal investments, which will be leveraged by First Nations in my hometown of Winnipeg. I'm thinking about the Bay Building, which is going to be turned into very important housing and other infrastructure that will support First Nations in Manitoba. I'm thinking about a national school food program, which, as a former educator myself, itself I believe to be critically important. I've been to several schools where, despite what my colleagues in the opposition continue to call bureaucracy and levy accusations of no food having actually been served, I can tell you that that's not true. There's food being served as we speak in Manitoba schools. I've been to them. I've seen those kids eat that food. That's an important piece for First Nations kids in Manitoba. I'm thinking of Freedom Road, which very early in the life of our government was an incredibly important move of reconciliation, which certainly my colleague Mr. Melillo, I would hope, applauds, as it is something that benefits both the community on the Ontario and Manitoba sides of the border. That has led to substantial economic development and has been a very important step in the right direction of righting some of the egregious historical wrongs. I'm thinking of the school building announcements that you just made in Winnipeg a couple of days ago with many First Nations communities. The better education our kids have, the better the prospects of economic development. So with all of that, Minister, perhaps you can reflect on your own more broadly about the ways in which, whether that's relative to Winnipeg, Manitoba, or all of Canada, the Government of Canada in the last 9 years has made positive steps towards ensuring that the economic well-being is of First Nations in Canada and that economic reconciliation have been at the forefront of your decision-making. Thank you.
Well, that's quite a list, actually, and it's just such a short and partial list, and yet so important because you're talking about what many people talk about, the social determinants of health, and I would say we should broaden that out and say the social determinants of wealth as well. Shoal Lake is a perfect example, and Freedom Road, had an opportunity to go to Shoal Lake and use Freedom Road to get to Shoal Lake, and when I got there, the community is in a rejuvenation, actually, right now. There are many members who live in Winnipeg who now are able to commute back and forth to the community, who are providing services to the community, leadership, health services, education services. In fact, their water treatment plant which is also new and funded by the federal government, is actually fully run by Shoal Lake members and is maintained by Shoal Lake members. So I think what you're hitting on is that these investments that we've been making, and I did mention the number in my speech, it's 1,100% more than the previous Conservative government spent on Indigenous priorities. These investments are not just social investments. They actually contribute to stronger communities and communities' ability to educate their kids at home, closer to home, have higher graduation rates. That creates more opportunities for young people to go to post-secondary, college, university, and then oftentimes come back home to provide services and continue to grow that community. Thank you for mentioning the school announcement as well. That was such an exciting announcement. So many of those communities have continued to have to send their high schoolers out of town, and as you would know, being in Winnipeg and other, maybe MP Melillo also knows these stories, kids that have to leave home to go to school in a city far away it's really challenging for those kids.
Minister, I'm sure you could continue to go, but one of the things that it seems to me is of critical importance to economic reconciliation and is making sure that water rights are respected. Because, of course, when you have water rights, which therefore leads to incredibly important water infrastructure, you can improve economic development. I couldn't help but note that during the request for unanimous consent just a couple of days ago in the House, for this bill, which we just spent countless hours debating and passing here at committee, Bill C-61 is the one I'm referring to, that it was only Conservative members that refused to give unanimous consent to expedite that. What's the impact of a further delay on C-61 as a result of Conservative behavior going to be on the economic development future for First Nations on reserve?
Thank you for the question, and I know that all parties at this table worked really hard to amend the bill and make the bill even better, including the Conservative Party, who submitted successful amendments, and they were accepted. And I would actually probably just quote Chief Munias, who is from Niskandaga, as you know, First Nation, in MP Melillo's riding. And he said this after that vote. He was actually so disappointed. He said, "We need need you to act now. We don't need perfection. We just need your best efforts. And he had more to say in the media as well about how long that community has suffered and how far they've come, and yet how this essential legislation is going to prevent Niskandiga from ever having to return to those days being neglected and underfunded by a federal government.
Well, thank you very much, Minister, and I certainly hope that
Sorry, Mr. Carr,
yes, Mr. Chair.
You've elapsed your timing here. Sorry, my mic didn't go on there. But with that, we're moving over to our next questioner. Au prochain, on va à Monsieur Lemire.
So we have Mr. Lemire for 6 minutes now. Thank you very much. Madam Minister Haidu, the directors of Indigenous businesses have to have true and direct access to the opportunities coming from federal procurement as equal partners and not as marginalized spectators. Obviously, we have to address ourselves to true Indigenous people. This is the interpreter. Can you hear that? Thank you. So you have almost 6 minutes. So I'll start again. Yes, you can do that. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. So the leaders of Indigenous businesses have to have true and access in terms of federal procurement as equal partners and not marginalized spectators. So true Indigenous businesses, the priority has to be reinforce the capacities, simplify the processes, and assure an economic framework that places them at the center of decisions. If we want the economic statement to be more than words, we have to act now. Currently, the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business gives us the impression of going beyond its initial mandate by being a direct competitor to a council that was mandated by the APN. I'm talking about MAICA, the National Association of Indigenous Funding. The others, the CGF Council, the Council of Indigenous Officer Development, the Center for Indigenous Governance, FOA. And what's more alarming is that the CCIB wants to take over the management of the list of Canadian suppliers, a job that should be accomplished by the First Nations, the Métis, and the Inuit. This fragments everything and takes away from Indigenous people resources which should come to them, as is the case in the current study. How will you intervene to have that motion respected by the APN to ensure that in legitimate financial institutions that are directed by Indigenous people can have their Indigenous autonomy? It's a very good question. I think that's the problem with the collection of programs, because there's no consensus as to the approach for reform. And we're speaking with the partners. I think that we have to adopt an approach that will allow each organization to have a voice. For example, the Inuit and the Métis, the two organizations for First Nations, every partner has to, or takes a different approach currently. For us, we need to find a pathway that is fair and that the partners approve. In the current case, we're talking about more than just having a voice. We're talking about leadership. And I'm wondering why the CCIB is in the conversation. Why do we hear that $5 million would be given rather than to businesses recognized by the APN? Is the CCIB an Indigenous organization? Who funds the CCIB? What I've heard is that it comes directly from the major Bay Street firms, so white people who have corporate interests that are very different from those of First Nations, and who can ensure us, if it's not you, that their goal is entirely for First Nations. Is CCIB an Indigenous organization? I disagree with this perspective, because the CCIB has Indigenous members as well as Métis members and others. NACA has First Nation members, and there are also Indigenous or Métis businesses. But I think there's room for all organizations to have the opportunity and the responsibility to lead this work. We've heard many times that NACA's requests that and also the CGF, the Business Management Council, will send a memorandum to Cabinet, or will be an objective of memorandum to Cabinet, as there are objectives that will fund their members in the next budget. But these organizations are supported, and they're documented, and you told us that. But over the past few weeks, some of them came to the cocktail event of the Liberals with the Prime Ministers. There also were discussions at the APN where I came to your presentation. Can we have a legitimate guarantee at this point, considering that it's halfway through December, and there are formal requests that have been made to Minister Freeland so that the funding of Indigenous funding initiatives could be guaranteed? To my mind, my job is to write a letter, a budget letter, to Minister Freeland. Well, we're halfway through December. Has this letter been written and sent to Minister Freeland? If we're talking about economic reconciliation, we expect that your cabinet would file a memorandum to Cabinet. My department's working with me in the letters for the budget, and I can't and there are many, I can't say a lot about the subject and components of the letter, but of course there is a part of the letter which is in the, which talks about the goal of economic reconciliation. Thank you very much, Mr. Lemire.
Ms. Idlout, sorry, for 6 minutes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Unfortunately, you get to hear directly from me, as the interpreter that's normally provided for me is not here. I think that the committee is working on ensuring that we have more resources other than one interpreter, so that my language rights could be respected, and so that I could ask my questions in Inuktitut, but I will proceed in English anyway. I do have similar questions to Sebastian that he asked about the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business, because I think we all have been led to this point because of the vagueness of what we hear about who Indigenous organizations are. I think, though, that we're all very clear that we know who are rights holders, Indigenous rights holders. So my question is for you, Patty. Do you believe that CCIB qualifies as an Indigenous organization led by rights holders similar to the Financial Management Board, NACA, and the First Nations Financing Authority?
I don't know which one's on. Is it on? I'm really uncomfortable being in the position of determining whether an Indigenous organization is a legitimate Indigenous organization. I can tell you that we have respect for the work that CCIB does and that many of the organizations they represent are indeed Indigenous businesses. I can tell you they're also a partner in helping the Government of Canada figure out the next steps to transform the approach to identifying and certifying Indigenous businesses. And I can tell you that the sooner that the Government of Canada gets out of the business of defining what an Indigenous business is, the better. But it won't stop the questions. And I think what Indigenous people are saying is that they need to be able to, for themselves, define who are their people, who are their members. And, you know, this is a vestige and a continuation of a colonial country that has a number of different programs and approaches that are in the position of having to certify indigeneity. But what I can say is that we have CCIB as one of the partners, not the only partner, that is working on the question of how best to transfer this role, and I think a very important role at that.
If I could just simplify my question, do you think that CCIB qualifies as an Indigenous organization?
I think that they are an organization that has been providing an immense amount of service to many First Nations and other Indigenous business providers, and I think that they have an important voice in the work that we're doing, but they're not the only voice.
Okay, you're clearly not going to ask my direct question, so I'm going to ask a different question.
I think I did answer the question, actually, so I'm not sure.
Okay,
maybe
yes,
I misunderstood your
so
question.
yes or no, does CCIB qualify as an Indigenous organization?
Are an Indigenous
Yes or no?
organization that that
Thank
provides
you.
a service along with
Thank you.
others.
You've answered my question. I have another question, and I'm glad to see that the Assistant Deputy Minister Keith Kahn is here. Since the Prime Minister had highlighted in Budget 2023 the need for economic reconciliation, terminology that I don't agree with, by the way, the Indigenous Economic Council has been in collaboration with Indigenous Services Canada on recommendations to achieve this goal. When do you anticipate that these recommendations being brought to Cabinet for discussion and decision?
But go ahead.
Okay, thanks for the question. So we're looking at some cabinet dates, and we just haven't landed on a date yet, but we're certainly, it's in our line of sight.
So this was based on Budget 2023 proposals, and could you explain to us why there's been a delay?
The questions around cabinet process and dates seem to me to fall under cabinet confidence, but I can tell you we're working with partners, and we want to make sure that what we bring to cabinet is going to truly reflect the needs of what Indigenous partners are saying must be included in a renewed economic reconciliation strategy.
Thank you. My next question is to Minister Duclos. Being the Minister of Public Services and Procurement, I'm wondering about how you work with Indigenous Services Canada on Indigenous procurement. What is how is it that you operate to make sure that Indigenous procurement meets the minimum 5% that we all know is the target?
Thank you very much for the question. Let me first say that I will work with you to see with the Translation Bureau how we can always support the needs that you have legitimately expressed earlier. We recognize that speaking in our preferred language is always better when it comes to providing a voice to those people that we have the fortune and the responsibility to represent. Second, I am closely working with Minister Hajdu in many different ways. When it comes to the Indigenous Business Directory, we're supportive of their work in the development of guidance on how it can support the broader Indigenous procurement strategy, because there is obviously a key link between the directory and the strategy. We're also working with them to coordinate the outreach and to raise awareness to indigenous businesses so that they can fully participate in the federal government's procurement. That comes with coordinating the standing offers and the supply arrangements that can stimulate indigenous business development. We're also working with indigenous services to draft and update contract clauses based on ISCA's guidance. And finally, we're working together to identify and reduce and sometimes eliminate barriers to federal procurement activities that are hitting indigenous businesses and workers. And as I will end by saying that, as Minister Hajdu said, and as you every opportunity also support, the reconciliation comes with the recognition that for too many years colonialism has created those barriers and those gaps, and it creates social and economic costs, obviously, but also broader costs for Canada, which we always should recognize and try to reduce as much as possible.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. So that completes the first round of questions. We're moving into the second round of questions, the 5 minutes, starting with Mr. Genuis. You have 5 minutes.
The Globe and Mail has a shocking story today about abuse of the Indigenous Procurement Program by the Canadian Healthcare Agency. According to a whistleblower, the government was putting in place tight constraints on the work of auditors as soon as they started to identify serious problems. The government was warned by auditors, and their response to those warnings was to make life more difficult for the auditors. Minister, you told my colleague Michael Barrett that you only heard about allegations against Canadian Healthcare Agency this weekend. Is that correct?
No, I did not. I told your colleague that I was made aware of the auditor's concerns overall about the program this weekend, and that it was deeply distressing to me, and that I.
But you were previously aware of his allegations against Canadian Healthcare Agency?
What I am saying is that that was the first I heard of Mr. Hartle's allegations.
When did you first become aware of concerns about the indigeneity of this partnership involving the Canadian Healthcare Agency? When did you first become aware of that?
The department routinely reviews, as you've heard before.
When did you first become aware? It's not about the department. When did you first become aware?
As I said, this weekend, I too heard about what was in the Globe and Mail, and I was.
But when did you
concerned.
first become aware of concerns about the Canadian Healthcare Agency?
I think you've asked questions about this company before, have you not?
So when did you first become aware of it, though?
So the first time I became aware of it was, I don't have an exact date, but a few months ago.
A few months ago. Minister, you said in response to my questions that, quote, I would say that it was an abuse of being on the list without adequate representation. You said this about Canadian Healthcare Agency back at the end of October. And you've tried to represent the facts in a very different way to my colleague, Mr. Barrett, which is disappointing to say the least. The AFN has said that.
I could respond to that because that is actually putting words in my mouth, and that is not what I said.
Can I have the time, Mr. Chair? I've got another question.
So, Mr. Genuis, you do have the time, and the minister will have an opportunity to respond to that.
Okay, I have 3 minutes left. The AFN. Says that you're not hitting your 5% target. It's closer to 1%. That's what Chief Joanna Bernard told the Government Operations Committee. Is the AFN correct?
Not according to our records, but what I can say is that I understand the concern, and I'm actually, as I said to your colleague, glad that the Conservative Party is fighting so hard to protect this 5% procurement target. This is good news. It means that we all want this program to work better, including the AFN.
You're not answering my question, and you were somewhat inaccurate in your response with Mr. Barrett. So you don't agree with the AFN, I understand.
the AFNs, and that, in fact, in some departments, we are exceeding the procurement target of 5%.
You're either hitting it or you're not. It's not as if the AFN is experiencing things differently, right? You're either hitting the 1% or you're hitting a 5%.
Well, what I would say is that our data demonstrates that we are actually hitting our procurement target amongst
your data
a number
also
of different
shows,
departments.
Madam Minister, that you're dramatically purging the Indigenous business list. That since 2022, you've taken over 1,000 companies off that list. You've taken over 100 companies off this year alone. And I'm trying to square the fact that, on the one hand, not a single person or company has been penalized for Indigenous identity fraud, but on the other hand, you're dramatically purging the list, which suggests that there's some people on that list that shouldn't be on that list. How do you square the fact that Indigenous leaders across the board are saying that abuse of this program is rampant? You're taking many companies off the list, and yet nobody's been held accountable for Indigenous identity fraud.
Well, actually, what I would say is that Indigenous peoples are saying that economic reconciliation and the work of the Government of Canada in terms of its procurement target is actually changing realities for Indigenous businesses across the country. But
Sorry,
I would
Minister,
say
could
that
you just
I agree
answer the
with
question?
You, Mr.
Is it acceptable that nobody's been held accountable for Indigenous identity fraud by your government?
What I would say is it's great that you care about this program
Could you answer
to the
the
degree
question?
that you do. Because what we all agree,
Is it acceptable
what we
to
all
you
agree about,
that nobody has been
Mr.
held
Chair,
accountable?
point of order.
I can't answer the question, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Carr.
Just a problem we've run into previously, but very difficult for us to have translation services provided adequately when there's talking back and forth. So perhaps we could just resettle things. Thank you.
Yeah, just on the same point of order, I agree with Mr. Carr. I'm trying to ask questions, and the minister is not answering them, and I think should be brought to order. I've got 30 seconds left. And I'd just like to know whether she thinks it's acceptable.
Garnett, before doing that, I just want to remind members here not to talk over the witnesses. We want to make sure we're avoiding the crosstalk. It makes it very difficult for the interpreters to do their work, and for members that have challenges hearing as well. So just want to remind members to do that.
Et, Monsieur le Président, c'était les deux voix que j'ai entendues. Alors.
So I heard many voices.
30 seconds, I'll try one more time, Minister. Nobody has been held accountable by your government for Indigenous identity fraud. Meanwhile, you've taken Canadian Healthcare Agency off the list, and you can't tell me why. You've taken Dalian Enterprises off the list, and you can't tell me why. You've taken over 1,000 companies off the list, yet nobody's been held accountable for it. Is it acceptable to you that not a single company has ever been held accountable for Indigenous identity fraud by your government?
It appears to me that I have answered your question, and I have answered your question repeatedly. But I will tell you that removals from the list are, for many reasons, that can be quite benign. For example, businesses could be closed. They could be non-responsive to requests from the department.
1,000 businesses are suddenly non-responsive?
Changes in the business ownership structure. There could be a number of different reasons.
Okay.
And
Could you provide a breakdown of those reasons for each of those companies?
So,
Appel au règlement.
Appel au règlement, Monsieur Carr.
Point of order. Yes, again, it's very, very difficult to hear in both official languages. We do have Francophone members and other people listening in both languages. So, Chair, I hope that our colleagues can try to apply the rules in a better way. Thank you. Mr. Carr, the time has run out for Mr. Genuis.
Opportunity to finish her answer, and then we'll move on to the next questioner.
It's affirming that the Conservative Party agrees that the 5% target is so important that we must ensure that the way that we do this affirms Indigenous identity. But it is also clear that the Conservative Party has no idea what to do about this problem. We do, and we're going to take control.
Thank you very much, Mr. Genuis. Next, we're moving to Ms. Gainey for 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et bienvenue.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to our witnesses. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. I will start with Mr. Duclos. Minister, we know that there are often bad actors that try and take advantage of the procurement system. I know that our government has also acknowledged and recognized that situation, and that major measures were taken to put an end to this and hold people accountable. can you tell us more about the measures that have been taken to strengthen the integrity of the system? Thank you very much, dear Anna. And before answering your excellent question, I would maybe like to talk about the more general framework. In Canada, there are about 75